You have to consider Montgomery because he is the best known soldier of the Second World War, best known British soldier of the Second World War. You probably know my views. He's not the best. I've been widely published on the subject of Montgomery and had several death threats from his fans. But you have to consider him. I mean, as far as the public is concerned, Churchill and Montgomery won the war, full stop. The fact that that's not in accordance with the facts is irrelevant. You have to consider them. Now, the important thing, and this is a big difference between Alexander and Montgomery, historically, the British fight their wars with professional armies. Professional armies are expensive, therefore they're small. Therefore, we fight our wars in coalitions. And the coalition partners may well have agendas that don't coincide exactly with ours, but the British commander must understand the agendas of his allies and at least appear to sublimate what he might want to do himself to the greater good of the alliance. If you can't do that, then you cannot be described as a great British commander.
Hello and welcome to the pod, and this week I'm doing a bit of a clear up on a chat I had about 6 months ago, which was the first episode in my Great British Commanders series. This is for World War II, and we settled on Bill Slim as our greatest British commander. But this episode is to discuss the other candidates, or as I've called them, the also-rans. So Gordon returns, and we chat about those commanders that lost out to Slim. Now, if you're a fan of Field Marshal Montgomery, then prepare to be upset, as you heard at the top there. If you think Arthur Bomber Harris is a terrible fellow who should have been in the dock at Nuremberg, then Gordon might disappoint you. But you'll come away with a good knowledge of the top British commanders of the Second World War. Now, there's a slight camera malfunction about midway through, but I kept it in just for your amusement, as it amused me. Coming up, I've got plenty more history, including the Mafia, and a chat with the host of Spy Masters, Antonia Senior, as she talks about her new espionage podcast. Gordon will also be returning to do a similar talk on our roundup of the World War I also-rans. Please do share, rate and review, I'd be so grateful, but until then it's Gordon and me on Great British Commanders World War II also-rans. Gordon, welcome back to the podcast and are continuing our series on Great British Commanders. We've done the 20th century, and really in the rules that I made up, we've done a commander from the Second World War and a commander from the First World War. And it was pretty arbitrary. I've decided that, and so we have done that. But I was conscious we've missed out a lot of names who would be in the frame for Great British Commander. We're going to go down, I think, probably to the early 19th century, but I wanted to cover a few of the also-rans, and I thought I would start Second World War as we've done in our series. We kicked off with Slim, undoubtedly I think the best commander of the Second World War, but of the also-rans I had written down a short list which you may well disagree with. Okay, there's one name you definitely will disagree with. But I had a short list of 3, and then I was going to pick 4, but I couldn't decide between all these names, and I'm including RAF and Navy as well, because it's commanders, not generals. So number 1 on my list of also-rans, so who wins second place, is Field Marshal Alexander, Tunis. Then I had Lord Alanbrooke.
Yep.
Then I had Montgomery.
Yep. You have to consider Montgomery because he is the best known soldier of the Second World War, best known British soldier of the Second World War. You probably know my views. He's not the best. I've been widely published on the subject of Montgomery and had several death threats from his fans. But you have to consider him. I mean, as far as the public is concerned, Churchill and Montgomery won the war, full stop. The fact that that's not in accordance with the facts is irrelevant. You have to consider him. And I agree with you. I think Alexander has to be considered. Alanbrooke, obviously, as Chief of the Imperial General Staff for most of the war, you have to consider him. So I wouldn't disagree with any of those 3.
Oh, okay, that's good. Right. Then number 4, and my list from that, This is where I've rather running out of knowledge, I'll have to be honest. So I've picked from the army one other name, Auchinleck,
Yep.
and then the rest I've picked a mixture of RAF and Royal Navy. So
Yep.
Keith Park, Arthur Bomber Harris.
Mhm.
That's a controversial choice, I'm aware. Dudley Pound in the Navy, Andrew Cunningham in the Navy, and then going back to the RAF again, Hugh Dowding and Charles Portal. Now, I've picked those names because they're kind of quite well known, but not through any kind of great military insight on my part. So I'm really hoping you can sort of point me in the right way. But if you had to pick, and this is a really difficult task, but this podcast would go on forever if we
Yeah.
listed every single one. If you had to pick a name out of all those names, which would you pick?
Well, from the Navy, I would certainly pick Andrew Cunningham. I mean, he was by far, I think, the finest naval commander on the British side. In fact, naval commander in the Western Theatre. Churchill didn't like him. Churchill was really forced to appoint him as First Sea Lord eventually. The reason he didn't want him was because he knew Cunningham would argue with him and tell him where to get off. Dudley Pound was a sick man, a very ill man, which I think he knew, but I don't think anybody else knew. And when he died, Churchill tried to persuade Admiral Fraser, who was the commander of the Home Fleet, to take over. And Fraser said to Churchill, I have the confidence of my fleet. Cunningham has the confidence of the whole of the Navy. Cunningham, if you remember, was when he was organizing the withdrawal from Crete, when the Navy was carrying out one of its traditional roles of removing a beaten army to be used somewhere else. And somebody said to Cunningham, look, we're losing a lot of ships. And the Navy did lose a lot of ships over that one. And Cunningham said, it takes 3 years to build a ship. It takes 300 years to build a reputation. The evacuation will go on. I mean, one of the things Cunningham did, for example, in 1940, when the French fleet at Oran was blasted, was sunk, Cunningham managed to persuade the French vessels, the French fleet that had taken a refuge in Alexandria. He persuaded them to put up their hands without any force, because he was a diplomat. I mean, he's a great leader and a great wager of naval warfare, but he was also a diplomat. So he would be my naval choice. Of the generals.
And sorry to interrupt you, Gordon. One
Yeah.
name I was thinking was the Dunkirk evacuation. So crucial, really. And
Ramsay. Yeah.
Admiral Ramsay, yes,
Yep.
I should have included him.
Ramsay, of course, was, as you know, was brought back from retirement to deal with that. And of course, he's also the mastermind of the naval aspect of Overlord, which is sometimes forgotten. Getting all those ships, I mean, the largest naval operation ever before or since, getting them all organized, getting them all in the right place, the right time, getting them there. I mean, that was all Ramsay. Montgomery, of course, took credit for it, but it was Ramsay and Morgan on the army side who did all the work.
Tragically killed in a plane crash, wasn't he, Ramsay?
Yeah, he was being sent off to the Far East because the war in the Far East is still going on. And on his way there, he was killed. Yeah.
Right, RAF. I rattled off a few names. Just a reminder for the listeners and viewers. Keith Park, Arthur Bomber Harris, Hugh Dowding, and Charles Portal. They didn't really have nicknames like Harris did they?
No, I would actually pick Bomber Harris, if only because he's the only one that I've actually met. And he was, I think rightly, he felt very aggrieved at the end of the war. He felt that the carpet had been pulled out from under him because after the Dresden firebombing, a lot of people were saying, this is frightful. How could you possibly do this? 3 months before the end of the war. Well, of course, at the time, we didn't know the war was going to end in 3 months. We hadn't yet got across the Rhine. The B-2s were landing on London. The Russians had specifically asked us to bomb Dresden because Dresden was on the main supply route to the Eastern Front. It also had a number of factories that made optics for artillery pieces and tanks. So it was a totally legitimate military target, in my view. But Churchill did say, well, perhaps that's rather a shame. Perhaps we'd gone too far. And Harris, who'd been told to do it. I mean, earlier on, Churchill had said to Harris, de-house the German population. Technically, that is a war crime because the Hague Convention says quite clearly you must not target civilians. Now, the problem that Harris had, indeed any bomber commander had, was that the technology to hit pinpoint targets didn't exist. So if you're trying to bomb a bridge, military target, a marshalling yard, military target, an artillery park, military target, but if you can only drop your bomb 500 yards away, that's no good. You know, a miss is as good as a mile. And the problem was that they simply couldn't hit the target. The technology didn't exist. I mean, today we've got smart weapons which can sort of stop at traffic lights, turn right, turn left, hit the target absolutely spot on. And we saw some film yesterday or the day before on what's happening against the Houthis. But that didn't exist. Bombing then was the bomber lying on his tummy, looking at the target, working out which way the wind was going, how fast the airplane was going, and telling the pilot right now and pressing the tit. It just wasn't accurate. And some statistics, which are quite interesting, produced by some civil servants in 1942, I think it was, showed that something like only 1 in 10 bombs got within a mile of the target, and the range for within 5 miles of the target, and the number got within 1 mile of the target. I mean, they just weren't hitting the targets. And this is where Churchill said, right, dehouse the German population. Because if you couldn't hit a bridge or a marshalling yard or whatever, but if you just drop your bombs over a city, you hit something. And that's what they did. And of course, that's one of the reasons why later on the Nuremberg trials, it was decided that what's called the tu quoque defense would not be acceptable. The tu quoque defense in law says, well, you did it first. You did it, so why shouldn't I do it? And of course, whether the Luftwaffe were the first to drop their bombs over a city or the RAF is still argued about, and it really doesn't matter very much. But technically, it's a war crime, but you couldn't do anything else. If you couldn't hit specific targets, then you hit the cities. If we hadn't done that, it's the only way the British had of hitting back. If we hadn't been doing it, the government would have fallen, probably. People wanted us to hit back. The only way we could hit back was by the bombers. Harris was the man who organized that. He was a pretty humorless chap, Harris. He was a South African originally by birth or by upbringing. Pretty humorless, but absolutely dedicated to what he was doing. He wouldn't allow any diversion. When people wanted bombers for something else that he regarded as peripheral, he wouldn't have it. He concentrated on bombing. Harris did a cracking good job within the parameters of what he could do. He was the only commander-in-chief who wasn't raised to the peerage immediately at the end of the war. The RAF resented that. One has to remember the Royal Air Force, which had, I think, something like 7% of British manpower, military manpower, had something like 50%, 25% of the deaths overall. For example, when we started bombing Germany, tour for an aircrew was 30 operations. Then they had a rest, and then the second tour was another 30. They realized, they worked out that it was impossible to finish the second tour. Statistically, you just couldn't.
You were most likely to die.
You were dead. So that had to be reduced. And you know, people forget that. I mean, Harris was within the parameters of what he was required to do. Harris did exactly what he was told to do, dehouse the German population. You can argue that the effect on German industry wasn't that great, because what the Germans did was move everything underground. And even, I mean, the effects on Hamburg, within something like a month, Hamburg was producing just as much base bits of kit as it was before the raids. But no, I also, the other reason I pick Harris is that he's controversial. There isn't anything like as much controversy over the other air commanders that you've mentioned who did their jobs jolly well, but aren't the subject of people daubing, baby killer and whatnot on his statue.
But that's interesting what you just say. I had always assumed that the air campaign, the bombing campaign, did have a big effect on German industry. Are you saying that it had a limited effect?
It had a very limited effect, but what it did do, it didn't reduce. The Germans were still producing the same number of aircraft, the same number of tanks, same number of artillery pieces. What they couldn't do is get them to the front. Now, that is what the bombing campaign did. It wrecked the roads, wrecked the railways. So although Germany is producing just as many tanks, just as many artillery pieces, just as many aircraft, The problem is getting them to the front. And that's what the bombing campaign did achieve. The other thing it achieved, which helped the Normandy landings, was that nearly all the anti-aircraft assets were pulled back to defend Germany. And therefore, and similarly, the Luftwaffe fighters, everything is pulled back to defend Germany. So when we land in Normandy, well, Luftwaffe really don't get a look in. I think I have something like 3 sorties the whole day. Very little anti-aircraft assets in Normandy, which of course helped us enormously. So that you can lay to the credit of the bombing campaign. But in terms of destroying German industry, not a lot.
It's interesting because we've had a few chats with historians. Keith Lowe, who wrote about the bombing of Hamburg, the devastation and civilian casualties. And then James Holland, who made an impassioned defense of the bombing campaign, and which I suspect you would agree with. But I just was wanting to I know we're probably dwelling on it a little bit too much, but it's an interesting subject because I think there was an argument, without putting words into James Holland's mouth, he was saying something along the lines of the German people had not risen up against the Nazi regime in any large scale way. And as you've just mentioned, it was the only way of hitting back at Germany when you don't have an army on German territory a few years before D-Day and the invasion of Germany. So really it was the only way to hit back and is entirely justified.
Yes, I think it was entirely justified. Before the war, people like Drouet said, the bomber will always get through. And this was the great belief that bombing would be so frightful that very quickly the populace would demand that the war came to an end. Of course, that never happened. It all really started with the bombing in the Spanish Civil War, Guernica. Now, what happened in Guernica? They only killed about 30 people in Guernica, but both sides exaggerated it. Franco exaggerated it because he wanted to say to the other cities, if you don't surrender, this is what will happen to you. The Republicans exaggerated it to make the nationalists appear more beastly than they actually were. And as the occupants of Guernica were Basques, nobody cared anyway. But the wrong lessons were taken from Guernica. Guernica be the first time that a town in the West, I mean, the Italians had been doing it to the Ethiopians for years, but nobody noticed. But it was the first time that a Western European town had been attacked from the air. And therefore people paid more attention to it than perhaps they should have done. And I think they took the wrong lessons. And people then believed that bombing, the German people didn't rise up. After all, if you and I had been 18-year-old Germans in 1930, we'd have been Nazis. Let's be frank about it. Here is somebody who says, "I'll remove the shackles of."
You mean I would have actually joined the Nazi Party?
Yes. Well, I'm not saying you'd joined the party, but you'd have voted for them. Here is someone who says, "I will remove the shackles of Versailles. I will give you full employment. I will build autobahns. I will allow rearmament." All the things, industry welcomed this, the army welcomed it, the landed classes welcomed it, the working classes welcomed it, no unemployment. So yeah, of course you'd vote for that. If they were able to convince you that actually Bolshevism and Judaism were one and the same, which of course they weren't, but that was the line that Nazis peddled. And if you believed that, so when your neighbor down the road is resettled in the East, you're probably not going to be so worried. And they did, of course, they didn't rise up. In the same way, of course, the population of London didn't rise up when the Luftwaffe was bombing the East End. The difference, of course, there is that the Germans never developed a strategic air force. The Luftwaffe was a brilliant tactical air force for supporting the armies on the ground. Nobody could do it better. They were brilliant. But they never developed a strategic air force. They never had bombers with the range or could carry a sufficient bomb load to be really effective. And although if you were living in the East End in the winter of 1940 and a bomb came down and flattened your house, I mean, you're going to be pretty impressed. But actually, they never really dropped enough to make a huge difference. Nothing like as much as a Lancaster, which was carried the biggest bomb load of any bomber, including the Americans, in the war. So they never did that. And the reason I think that they never developed a strategic air force is that they had always, and this goes way back, it goes back to Mark Brandenburg, if you like, in Prussia, and then unified Germany. They're looking for a short war. Germans win short wars. They don't win long wars. And the reason for that is a factor of geography, population, industrial base, and all the rest of it. And so the Luftwaffe was right from the beginning, was designed as a tactical air force, short wars, when in fact it didn't become a short war. They didn't have a strategic air force. By the time they start thinking about long-range bombers, it's far too late. And one of the reasons that Stalingrad falls, of course, the Luftwaffe cannot resupply because they don't have cargo aircraft big enough to get in the amount of, I think it was 1,500 tons a day that they needed. And they could, I think the most they ever got in was 350 tons or something like that.
Well, I think we probably dwelled enough on the bombing campaign. So just going back to my so it sounds like we've got Harris even more than any other Royal Air Force commander or Royal Navy commander. And then Auchinleck, he's sacked by Churchill, but does well in India, doesn't he?
He'd done well everywhere. He was a rising star of the Indian Army. And in 1940, the British establishment, military establishment, are terribly worried that they have not got enough officers of the ability to make corps commanders in this rapidly expanding army, because the British Army is expanding hugely with conscription. Where are our really good officers that we can make corps commanders? Hardly any. We're very short of them. And somebody said, oh, well, there's a chap called Auchinleck in the Indian Army, and he's brilliant. Get him over. So Auchinleck is brought over to England. Initially, he's going to command a British corps, and then he's sent to Norway. Now, if you want to see how not to run a military campaign, look at Norway 1940. It is a total cock-up. Who's to blame? Churchill. Everything that could go wrong does go wrong through mismanagement. It's not just one of those things. It's mismanagement. It's ridiculous decisions being made by Churchill, who's the First Lord of the Admiralty, the politician in charge of the Navy. Auchinleck is told to go and have a look and see what he thinks. And he comes back and says, look, the thing is hopeless. The British troops are callow, are the words he used, compared to the Germans. This has got all the makings of a complete disaster. Withdraw. That annoyed the British. Who is this sepoy general? Who's this Indian coming in criticizing British troops? So that didn't increase his popularity with the British. He then did become a corps commander, and a very good corps commander. Very good plans for the defense of England, defense of the South Coast, defense against invasion if it came, etc. One of his divisional commanders is Montgomery. Montgomery takes an instant and totally irrational dislike of Auchinleck.
That's not the first time he does that, is it?
Well, it's the first time they meet.
I mean, first time Montgomery takes the irrational and
this is what Montgomery does. Now, why does he develop this dislike of Auchinleck? Well, partly I think because Montgomery didn't get into the Indian Army, and he has this long-standing prejudice against the Indian Army because he couldn't get into it. He wanted to get into the Indian Army. Why? Because he could live on his pay. He would have been a disaster. As somebody who spent 30 years in the Gurkha battalion, I can tell you Montgomery would have been a disaster in the Indian Army. He wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes. Auchinleck is tall, socially adept, good-looking. He's all the things that Montgomery isn't. When Auchinleck is then sent off to the Middle East, Churchill having sacked Wavell because Wavell won't tell him what he wants to hear. Wavell's quite amusing on the subject of Churchill. He says that Churchill's tactical and strategic knowledge stops somewhere at the end of the Second Boer War, which is probably about true. So he sacks Wavell. He's already sacked John Dill, of course, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, because he won't go along with Churchill's schemes. Auchinleck goes off to Egypt, and ultimately he gets sacked because he says he cannot mount an offensive. Churchill's constantly saying, you've got to go on the attack, got to go on the attack. Auchinleck is saying, yeah, fine, but I've got to have the assets first. I've got to have the fuel in position. I've got to have the ammunition. I've got to have the vehicles, got the men. And I can't do it before the beginning of September. Churchill and Brooke, who's taken over from Dill as chief of the Imperial General Staff, they fly out, and Auchinleck is sacked. Corbett, the chief of staff, is sacked largely because he's Indian Army. Dorman Smith, who's the assistant chief of general staff, is sacked. he is one of Montgomery's bête noirs anyway, because when Dorman Smith was a student at Staff College, when Montgomery was a DS, a member of the directing staff, Dorman Smith, by the way, is the only person before or since to get 100% on the tactics exam of the Staff College entrance exam. I mean, even I only got 80-something%.
What's the average mark? Just so we slightly know.
I think it's changed that. It's the pass mark is 40. The competitive vacancy pass mark used to be 80, but that was stopped in 69. Had it still been current in 1970, when I took the staff exam, I would have got a competitive vacancy.
Gordon,
the reason they stopped competitive vacancies, quite rightly in my view, was that it was all the greasy swats who could get time off to study for the bloody thing, whereas those of us who were running around in the jungle didn't get time off to study for it. I actually didn't do any studying at all, and I didn't read any of the set books. But I still, though I said it myself, did pretty well. And then I didn't go to Staff College, but that's another story. Now, the point is that Dorman Smith was a student under Montgomery. And when the 1-year course, I think it was 2 years then, ended, Dorman Smith took all of Montgomery's précis, all the papers that Montgomery had written, took them out onto the lawn in front of the Staff College at Camberley and burnt them. And Montgomery, of course, knew this, and revenge was sweet much later on. He does for Dorman Smith later on in Italy, but that's in the future. So Auchinleck goes out. Auchinleck is sacked, and in goes Montgomery. Now, Montgomery is a poodle of Brooke's. Brooke always looked after those who had been under him, and of course Brooke was the corps commander on the retreat to Dunkirk when Montgomery was divisional commander. Montgomery had been a student at Staff College when Brooke had been there as a directing staff. So he wants to put in Montgomery. Now, the initial choice was Gott, Strafer Gott. Gott was summoned to Cairo to take over. Gott, a very experienced armored soldier, been in the desert, very experienced, been a very good commander of the 8th Army, but he was killed in an air crash. He was shot down on his way to Cairo. So Brooke was able to insert Montgomery. Montgomery is sent out to take over from Auchinleck. He arrives there 3 days before the handover, and he is incredibly rude, ill-mannered to Auchinleck, totally unnecessarily. When he then takes over, he claims that the only plan Auchinleck had was for a retreat back to the Delta, which was a lie. Auchinleck had no plans for a retreat back to the Delta. Auchinleck had prepared, well, of course, he'd won First Alamein. And Montgomery never talks about First Alamein. That was Auchinleck's battle. He had prepared the plan for Almahalfa, which was Montgomery's battle, but it was Auchinleck's plan. And of course, Second Alamein, or Alamein, was also Auchinleck and Dorman Smith's plan. Montgomery is allowed, Montgomery says, I cannot attack until the end of October. Auchinleck is sacked because he said he can't do it before the beginning of September. Now, fortunately, Auchinleck is not in the doldrums for very long, because he is appointed commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, and thank God he was, because it's Auchinleck who builds up the Indian Army, trains it, deploys it, and in many ways then allows Slim for his victories. And Auchinleck very much backed up Slim, and Slim always paid due credit to Auchinleck for the work that he had done as commander-in-chief of the Indian Army. Now, Auchinleck was a gentleman. Montgomery made the most appalling criticisms, which were untrue, of Auchinleck in his memoirs. Lots of people sued Montgomery. The Italian ambassador, the Belgian ambassador, summoned the British ambassador to complain about what Montgomery had said about their armies in his memoirs. He totally upset the Americans, etc. The only thing that Auchinleck did was he said field marshals do not sue each other. Had he sued Montgomery for libel, he'd have won, but he didn't. Gentlemen don't do that. The only thing he did do was insist that in the second edition of Montgomery's memoirs, there was a note saying, which toned down the criticism of Auchinleck. Auchinleck went off, retired to Morocco, never wrote his memoirs, unfortunately. It's a pity. Auchinleck was a very great man. There is no question about that. He was appallingly traduced by that little ship, Montgomery. And of course, I don't know if you've read Montgomery's memoirs. You should. It's appalling. Did more harm to Anglo-American relations than anything since Benedict Arnold, I should think. But yeah, that's Auchinleck, a great man, no question.
Well, Yes, so Auchinleck is certainly then ahead of Montgomery. Let's talk about Montgomery, because to me, I just, if one takes one particular battle that he's responsible for, and that being Arnhem, or the Operation Market Garden, I should
Yeah.
say. I've read a number of different accounts now. I mean, I'm not as well read as you are, but I've read a number of different accounts, and I cannot believe how he thought that this was going to work. And it seemed to me, and I said this to actually, I think it was Mark Urban who wrote an account of the paratroop regiment in two para, I think, in the Second World War. It seemed like Montgomery had this airborne division and he needed to use it, so he just thought, oh well, I'll use it, in Holland, and it'll work.
I mean, it was most un-Montgomery plan, really, because Montgomery was normally very, very cautious. I mean, he'd made his name in Alamein, wrongly in my view, but he had. The church bells had rung, he'd been promoted, and he was desperate not to lose any of that. So he's desperately, desperately cautious. He's the architect of Dieppe, of course, but he's posted to the Far East before Dieppe is exposed as the total shambles that it was. But as far as Market Garden is concerned, how did he or anybody else think that a German army commanded by Model, who was a most aggressive commander, brilliant commander, was just going to pack up and go home with a corridor 45 miles long? It's only 15 miles wide. There's only one road. I mean, they'd have cut it off in 10 minutes. Even if Market Garden had worked, it wouldn't have lasted. It couldn't have done it. The route would have been cut. So it was absolute nonsense. Of course, Montgomery, very much sloping shoulders, he blames O'Connor. Now, he doesn't blame the man he ought to have blamed, who was the commander of 3 Corps, Horrocks, because Horrocks was Montgomery's poodle. O'Connor, who's a flanking corps, and really nothing to do with it. But Montgomery blames O'Connor. Now, O'Connor, if you remember, was captured along with, the father of a chap who commanded one of the parachute battalions, a general who had a Victoria Cross anyway.
Philip Neame.
The pair of them were captured in one of the skedaddles in North Africa. If O'Connor had not been captured, O'Connor would have commanded the 8th Army, and he would have made a much better fist of it than Montgomery. Now, of course, O'Connor eventually escapes from a prison camp in Italy, gets back to the Allied lines. He's reinstated in the army, and he's now a corps commander under Montgomery. Montgomery is very aware that actually O'Connor is a better soldier than Montgomery is. So who's he going to blame? He's not going to blame Horrocks, who's the man he should have blamed. He should have blamed himself, but also Horrocks. So he puts the blame on O'Connor, and he's very good at that, at sloping shoulders and evading the blame. I mean, Dieppe, all the blame goes on to Mountbatten, and rightly, a lot of it should have gone on to Mountbatten, because Mountbatten, as director of special operations or commander of special operations, some of the operations that he authorizes have no thought whatsoever of an exit strategy. Now, there are times in war, when you have to say to chaps, right, you're probably going to get killed. Sorry, if it doesn't work, you're dead. And in certain rare occasions, that is reasonable. But you shouldn't go on doing it. I mean, things like, the Cockleshell Heroes. I mean, that was appalling. I mean, that was a great example of heroism. And it was extremely heroic of the soldiers who did it, the Royal Marines who did it. But 2 of them were drowned. 4 of them were caught by the French police, handed over to the Gestapo and executed. Only 2 of them ever got back. I mean, they were expected to dump their uniforms, steal civilian clothes from washing lines, trek all across occupied France, eventually get into Spain, eventually get into Gibraltar. I mean, it's nonsense. All this sort of thing. So Dieppe, yeah, partially Mountbatten, but certainly Montgomery too should have had a lot of the blame for Dieppe, and he managed to avoid that. He avoids the blame for Arnhem by pushing the blame onto other people. And that's the sort of thing he did. I mean,
D-Day, was he good at
No, D-Day was Morgan, Freddie Morgan, who was the chief of staff to Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who was eventually Eisenhower. Morgan did all the planning for that. The only thing that Montgomery did do, rightly, was he and Eisenhower realized that actually they needed an extra beach. They needed to be able to land more divisions. They needed to be able to land 5 divisions and not 3. And that's when they found Utah Beach. Now, people say Utah's miles away, but it was the only beach. They're going to have an extra beach. That's the only one. And there's a big difference between distance between Utah and Omaha, which was ultimately one of the problems. Montgomery is the land commander, which he does perfectly adequately, the planning already having been done. And that's fine until Operation Goodwood, when the plan there was to draw the German armor onto the British sector over in the west, so that the Americans could break out from Saint-Lô. And that was a perfectly sensible plan. But Montgomery actually plans a breakout of his own. He issues maps showing objectives which are way out of the way away from the beachhead. And when Goodwood all goes wrong, when he doesn't manage a breakout, it does draw most of the German army onto the British flank, which is fair enough. But the British don't get any further than Burgos Ridge, which is, a stone's throw. And there's a desperate attempt to recall the maps and pretend it didn't happen. And Montgomery says, everything happened the way I planned. He would never admit that anything hadn't gone as he'd planned. Now, any soldier knows, the great saying, no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. Plans go wrong and you have to adjust them. Going back to Wellington said that the French make their plans of polished wood, and so when they break, that's it. I make my plans with rope, and when they go wrong, I just tie it together. And there's nothing wrong with saying, that's what I wanted to do. I couldn't, so I did this instead. Perfectly legitimate. Montgomery would never do that. Tedder, who was...
I think the camera's gone off, actually.
Yeah, I've just switched it back on. At least I'm trying to. Why has it gone off? Yeah, that's...
Oh, it's back on, yeah.
I don't know why I did that. I didn't touch anything. So,
yes.
The
Ghost of Montgomery.
Yeah, but the public still believe that Montgomery and Churchill won the war, and
I guess that's Alamein was such the first real victory, wasn't it? After so many defeats.
Yeah, I mean the British had a series of humiliating defeats. Norway, Dunkirk, Crete,
Singapore.
Singapore. Well, yeah, these weren't heroic retreats; they were humiliating failures. That's what they were, although nobody sort of admitted it at the time. I mean, Dunkirk, the miracle of Dunkirk, bollocks, it wasn't a miracle, it was a failure, a military defeat, a humiliating defeat, because the British Army wasn't capable of performing as it should. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, being starved of funds between the wars. Lloyd George in 1919 says we can afford to take chances on defence, we cannot afford to take chances on welfare. All the money goes into that. The army can't buy tanks. They can't. There's no funding available. 1918, the British Army is the most professional and competent army in the world at that time, and by 1939, it's got much the same equipment it had in 1918, but rather less of it. It's a disaster. So Alamein, where 10 British divisions, of which I think 5 of them were Empire divisions, 2 Indian, 2 Australian, and a South African division, and I think there were New Zealanders there as well, is chasing 11 under strength, written off by Berlin, sick, no air cover, Germans and Italians. It's Auchinleck's plan. Montgomery tinkers with it a bit, but even then he doesn't really apply that plan properly, and yet he's got Ultra, which of course wasn't, the world didn't know about until years later. So he knows every move the Germans are going to make, or the Italians are going to make. He knows because of Bletchley Park, Ultra, and he doesn't really make a terribly good job of it. He doesn't. The Germans and the Italians are able to withdraw at their own speed, their own pace. He then spends a very slow, ponderous advance up the North African coast, and never manages to cut Rommel off, despite the fact that he's got air superiority, complete air superiority. I mean, the Germans are short of vehicles. They're using captured British vehicles. They're short of fuel. The Royal Navy is stopping any resupply coming to them from Sicily and Italy. And Montgomery really doesn't make a very good job of it. Poor old Gatehouse, who's an armoured brigade commander, who commands his brigade from an armchair strapped to the top of a tank, says to Montgomery, he says, sir, you cannot send tanks against a line of German anti-tank guns without infantry support. You must put infantry in first to clear the anti-tank guns and then send in the armour. That's basic. Lance Corporal could have told them that. But Montgomery says, no, go on. And of course, what happens, the lead tank battalion tank regiment in the brigade, which is a yeomanry regiment. And I think of something like 64 tanks, 40 of them are knocked out. And Gatehouse says, told you so, get sacked. Montgomery sacks Lumsden. Lumsden's a fairly good chap. Lumsden had ridden in 7 Grand Nationals. He'd never won any of them, but he'd ridden in them. And riding in the Grand National is actually, I mean, that's quite a thing.
Absolutely.
And Lumsden, old Etonian, private income, didn't need to kowtow to Montgomery, told Montgomery that he looked ridiculous when he had the Australian bush hat with badges in it. When he then started wearing it, when Montgomery started wearing a black Royal Tank Regiment beret with a general's cap badge, which he was entitled to, and a Royal Tank Regiment cap badge, which he was not entitled to, Lumsden told him, and Lumsden gets sacked. That's the way Montgomery operates. Every time he moves, he takes with him his favoured staff officers, his sycophants, takes them with him. Slim never did that. When Slim was moved, he accepted whatever was there, you know.
How did he behave with Churchill, Montgomery? Was he respectful to Churchill?
Oh yeah, he kowtowed to Churchill.
And Alanbrooke and him got on.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, Alanbrooke had to rein him in a few times, particularly with his behaviour towards the Americans. He did write once to Alanbrooke saying, so and so, because he's a great one for any general that's up and coming that might steal some of Montgomery's glory. He tries to do him in. And on one occasion, he writes to Brooke saying, so-and-so is quite unfit to be an army commander. Of course, it's none of my business. And Brooke writes back and says, you're quite right, Monty, it isn't any of your business. So there's a certain amount of that. Churchill is reputed to have said to the king about Montgomery, sometimes I think Montgomery's after my job. And the king says, sometimes I think he's after mine. Now, whether that's true or not, it's a wonderful story. I'm not sure that Montgomery and the king obviously had met Montgomery, but how well he knew him, I don't know. This is Montgomery, and then he gets away with it.
Do you think the war could have ended sooner had you had someone like, I don't know, maybe if Alexander was in Montgomery's place? The argument I think we're probably getting there is that he was quite slow to get to well, he didn't get to Berlin, did he?
No, he didn't. And he got, originally, Alexander was quite a bit junior to Montgomery, but he gets promoted before him. Alexander, when he's promoted, is the youngest Major General in the British Army. Now, it's unfortunate in that Alexander was sent out to Burma when it was too late to do anything. There just had to be a retreat, and that was that. Then he's involved in the Italian campaign, and the glory is focused on Northwest Europe, on Overlord, not on Italy. But Alexander was a far better man. Alexander commanded a battalion in the First World War, a Guards battalion.
23, I think he was.
Yeah, 23. And they commanded a brigade, age 25.
Irish Guards, Gordon.
Irish Guardsmen, yeah.
The elite.
And he then, in the Russian Civil War, commanded a thing called the Polish Legion. He spoke Russian, fluent Russian. He was a far better man. And now the important thing, and this is a big difference between Alexander and Montgomery, historically, the British fight their wars with professional armies. Okay, we had conscription in the First World War from 1916, conscription in the Second War, but generally, we fight our wars with professional armies, and that goes way back to Edward I, if you like. Now, if you're going to fight your wars with a professional armies are expensive. Terms have got to be good or they won't join. Terms have got to be good or they won't stay. You've got to pay them properly. You've got to provide them with quarters and all the rest of it. Conscripts, they're there whether they like it or not. But professional armies are expensive. Therefore, they're small. Therefore, we fight our wars in coalitions. And the coalition partners may well have agendas that don't coincide exactly with ours, but the British commander must understand the agendas of his allies and at least appear to sublimate what he might want to do himself to the greater good of the alliance. If you can't do that, then you cannot be described as a great British commander. Now, Montgomery certainly understood logistics. He was an absolute master of logistics, no question about that. But what he couldn't do was operate in a coalition. Now, he was incredibly rude to the Americans. He dismissed them, he looked down on them, he disparaged them, openly criticizes them. After the war, as a field marshal, and had been replaced as CIJS, field marshals never retire technically. He was on a lecture tour in the United States, I think it was 1958. It was just at the the end of Eisenhower's first tour or the beginning of his second tour as president. And Eisenhower, the president of then the leader of the free world, which they'd been really since after D-Day, if you like. I mean, the British land more troops on D-Day than the Americans, but eventually the Americans have considerably more troops in Europe than we do. And the president, Eisenhower, took Montgomery round Gettysburg. Now, Gettysburg, American Civil War battle, Eisenhower lived on the edge of Gettysburg. He was an expert on it. And he spent a day taking Montgomery around and explaining to him the Battle of Gettysburg. And next day, Montgomery flew off to New York, and there was a press conference. And somebody said, Field Marshal, what did you think of General Eisenhower? And Montgomery said, oh, no soldier, no soldier. Next question. How bloody ill-mannered and undiplomatic. His memoirs caused great annoyance in America. Now contrast that with Alexander. Alexander knew the importance of getting people to work together. The Americans liked him. They saw him as a typical English gentleman. They thought he behaved properly, as indeed he always did. He understood the importance of working in a coalition. And that dates way back to the First World War, when he was able to work with the French and with the White Russians and all the rest of it. So that's the main difference, really, between them. And the reason Alexander hasn't had the adulation that Montgomery did was because the campaigns that he was associated with, through no fault of his own, were the glory days, like North Africa and Overlord.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic, Gordon. I've just realised that we've basically spoken for an hour or so on the Second World War generals.
Yep.
So I was wondering if we could reconvene at another date and do World War One, because I think we'll spend just as long going through. We've got Jellicoe, Beatty.
Beatty went to my old school, so I'm biased.
That'll be interesting, because yes, many people criticize him for Jutland, don't they? And there's Allenby. There's and a listener had nominated a name for the First World War that actually I was not familiar with. I have to admit that. Herbert Plumer.
Yeah, well, Plumer commanded the Second Army on the Western Front. Plumer was the one man, and I think we mentioned this when we were talking about Haig with Gary Sheffield, was the one man who might have been able to take over from Haig, but made it very clear that he wasn't prepared to.
Yes, he was. He behaved very well there.
Plumer's a good chap.
Yeah. And then there's Chetwood, or is he not senior enough, or he's?
Well, Chetwood, you could certainly consider him. I think you would have to include Kitchener. Actually,
I was about to say Kitchener, but wasn't he Minister of War rather than?
Yes, he was. But he's a sort of Marmite general, really. I mean, there were a number of really good things that he did. I mean, when he was Commander-in-Chief India, for example, in 1902. He realized that there would be another war. I mean, he realized this long before anybody else, and that the Indian army would have to be prepared to fight outside of India. And he embarked on a major reformation of the Indian army very successfully, where, of course, he ran foul of the Viceroy, Curzon, and eventually their differences went to the British government, and the government backed Kitchener, and Curzon had to resign as Viceroy. Then in the First World War, of course, he was the man who said right at the beginning, Asquith Prime Minister, Liberals, the Liberals are thought to be a bit soft on defence. They're not thought to be terribly enthusiastic about defence and making war. So Asquith thinks, right, who's the first soldier of the empire, as he was known, was Kitchener. Right, bring Kitchener in and make him Secretary of State for War. And that'll beef up our credentials, if you like. And Kitchener said to them right at the beginning, this will be a long war and I will need 1 million men. Actually, he needed 2.5 million. And the politicians all fell off their chairs because they were all thinking, oh, it'll be over by Christmas. They won't last very long. So Kitchener was the first one to realize that this would be a long war. He also, of course, was very much the guiding light for the new armies. Now, again, that's controversial because there are people who say, well, what he should have done was base it on the existing territorial force rather than create new armies. Again, you could criticize him for insisting that the new armies went out as divisions. What Kitchener really wanted was for the British to hold fire, not get too involved, wait until they'd built up a huge army. And then, probably in 1916 or 1917, on one blow and then decide the fate of Europe. Well, of course, that simply wasn't acceptable to the French. The French had a
Yeah, why
squat.
should they keep on dying whilst we
Yeah,
hold off and wait?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They had to keep attacking because they had a squatter sitting on their land. So that the British plan was never going to work.
But it does sound like you're certainly a strong proponent for Kitchener.
Well, I think basically, yes. I think there were things that he got wrong. One of the things why he was known as Kitchener of Chaos rather than Kitchener of Khartoum. And this is something that Haig picked up because when in South Africa, Haig was out there as a major and then a lieutenant colonel staff officer. And he saw the way Kitchener would cut through the chain of command. Instead of going to divisional commander, brigade commander, battalion, Kitchener would go straight to a battalion commander and tell him to do something. And this caused chaos. And Haig spotted this. And this is one of the reasons why Haig does not interfere with the chain of command. And occasionally Haig's criticized for doing that. People say, well, why didn't Haig step in and do that? Haig had seen the chaos that can be caused by people not following the chain of command. And that's a lesson, that's still extant today. I mean, if you're a divisional commander, you talk to the brigade commanders. They talk to battalion commanders. They talk to company commanders. If you start trying to short circuit that, you can get into all sorts of trouble. And that is certainly a criticism of Kitchener. He shouldn't have done that, and he should have known better. But he does tend to do that. He was, of course, outsmarted by the politicians. I mean, people like Lloyd George, who was a very nasty bit of work, in my view.
Yeah, the Welsh wizard, yes.
Yeah. I mean, he outmaneuvered Kitchener and got got control of armaments and production. He didn't do any better than Kitchener, but he produced a great deal of fuss and feathers, and everybody thought he did do better than Kitchener. And of course, Kitchener, as you know, was drowned in HMS Hampshire when he was going off to try and keep the Russians in the war. And HMS Hampshire hit a mine, German mine, down they went. So, as I say, he's a Marmite general. I'm more pro Kitchener than anti him. I think he's a much better man than perhaps history has given him credit for. I think he did a great deal of very good stuff and there were things that he got wrong.
Interesting. So that's a great taster for listeners to tune in for our next Also Rans episode for the First World War. It sounds like a disparaging name for them, but there can be only one. And Haig was our one for World War One and Slim for World War Two. Gordon, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, see you soon.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do share, rate and review with 5 stars if you can. I'd be hugely grateful. In the meantime, thank you and good night.